Welcome to Hold the Line. I'm Buck Sexton. It may well be the worst speech Joe Biden has ever given. The most reckless, the most divisive, the most delusional. But he did it, giving a speech yesterday in Philadelphia in which he declared that we are in the most serious challenge to our democracy since the Civil War. Seriously, here's what he said.
The assault on free and fair elections is just such a threat, literally. I've said it before. We're facing the most significant test of our democracy since the Civil War. That's not hyperbole. Since the Civil War. The Confederates, back then, never breached the Capitol, as insurrectionists did on January the 6th. I'm not saying this to alarm you. I'm saying this because you should be alarmed.
I'm not saying this to alarm you, but you should be alarmed. I mean, look, Joe Biden is not a smart man. He is president of the United States, but he's not a bright guy. He's just gone along with whatever he's had to say and do for the whole of his career. And Democrats were able to shoehorn him into the presidency this last time around because of the pandemic and all the crazy stuff they said about Trump and social media going all in on making sure that a Democrat would get elected, even suppressing true stories that wouldn't have been helpful to the Biden campaign, like about Hunter Biden's son. Hunter Biden, artiste, whose paintings are now going for $500,000. Yeah, that's a real thing. Joe Biden comparing the Confederates, the Confederate soldiers and the Confederacy to the January 6th rioters is really almost the definition of hyperbole or exaggeration. One was a military that was trying to overtake the United States Union and hundreds of thousands of casualties. And it was a war, folks. January 6th was a protest that got out of hand, turned into a riot, and the Capitol Hill police were able to clear it. And they were the only ones who killed anybody, as we know. One person killed Ashley Babbitt. Still don't know the name of that Capitol Hill police officer, nor the justification for that shooting. But this is all part of what you'd have to say is a great big lie, which is that all voter integrity laws that are being passed, all anti-fraud measures that Republicans are pushing for, are really rooted in the most vile racism. And they're quite explicit about this. I mean, the Democrats will actually say that that's why they're doing these things. Here's Joe Biden comparing it to Jim Crow.
The 21st century Jim Crow assault is real. It's unrelenting. And we're going to challenge it vigorously. While this broad assault against voting rights is not unprecedented, it's taking on a new and literally pernicious forms. It's no longer just about who gets to vote or making it easier for eligible voters to vote. It's about who gets to count the vote. Who gets to count whether or not your vote counted at all?
Yeah. I mean, he'll say anything. It doesn't matter how disconnected from reality this is. How much of a lie it is, let's just say it's a lie. I mean, the voter integrity law that Texas is going to pass when the absconded Democrats actually have to go back and do their job. Sorry, they're in the minority, Democrats. Too bad. The legislative branch still functions even when you don't get what you want, or at least it should. The left seems to disagree with that notion. It makes voting easier. In fact, voting is easier now in this country in general than it has ever been. And so what is really the big problem? Well, Democrats have a fundamental concern about being able to find and or stop voter fraud. That's what this really is. They will, in fact, sometimes say that voter fraud does not even exist. There are people who go to prison for it. So we know it's real, but they'll say, because it's all part of the propaganda, there's no such thing as voter fraud. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't mean anything. Here is White House spokesperson Karine Jean-Pierre, who is also speaking about using Joe Biden's Civil War line.
The president yesterday made it very clear where he was on the voting rights, right? He went to Philadelphia, a place where our democracy started, was created, and he was really clear on what he was seeing across the country with the attacks on our rights to vote, with what Republicans were doing across the country. And what he was saying as well is this is the biggest, kind of the biggest threat to our democracy since the Civil War.
The biggest threat to our democracy. She's repeating the Biden line there. Biggest threat to our democracy. A bigger threat than Nazi Germany and the domestic issues like the internment of Japanese Americans. Bigger threat than what we were facing with World War I and the U.S. intervention abroad and the plan. I mean, there's so much that we could point to here. There have been much more substantial riots, much more substantial challenges to public authority. In fact, the Democrats were in favor of weeks of riots, months of riots in 2020, but we're all supposed to forget about that. No, instead, they hold up these utter clowns from the Texas Democrat Party, and Chuck Schumer's calling them heroes.
What's happening in Texas by the GOP legislators and governor is just outrageous. These lawmakers are brave, they're courageous. And they're simply fighting for the right of every Texan to have the right to vote. What could be more all-American than that? These folks are going to be remembered on the right side of history. The governor and the Republican legislators will be remembered on the dark and wrong side of history.
Nope. But they're going to keep saying it. No one opposes lawful voting. This is the problem here. Democrats just say stuff that's not true. It doesn't matter to them because they've got a narrative and they're sticking with it. Changing early voting days or making sure that there's voter ID for either mail-in ballots or just in general is not stopping lawful voting. These are the basic measures that you have in place. There have always been some rules around voting, right? There have always been some rules on who can vote, when they can vote, how they vote. But what Democrats do is suggest that any regulation, any change at all that they don't like is racist and voter suppression of minority votes. And that's their narrative, that's their story. Because they feel very virtuous when they make that baseless assertion, and they also are able to drum up support for their side from their base, get donations going. Even Mitch McConnell is just like Joe Biden's living in a fantasy land.
Yesterday, the President of the United States delivered a speech that was set in an alternate universe. This is our new president who promised to lower the temperature, bring America back together and rebuild a civil society where we can dialogue as fellow citizens. That's the person who's now yelling that mainstream state laws are more dangerous than 2 world wars, more dangerous than poll test and Bull Connor and actual Jim Crow segregation, and somehow analogous to the Civil War? That's what the President of the United States said yesterday? What utter nonsense.
I mean, it is just total bull crap. You know it and I know it. Democrats have lost their minds.